All right, we should be live, so hello and welcome to the RPG Academy podcast. I am Michael, and I'm here tonight with a very special guest co-host. It's Matt Baume from the Queens of Adventure podcast. He's co-creator. It's a 5e actual play. It's been running for about a year and a half and has perhaps an interesting sort of take on things. Matt, welcome to the show. It is absolutely my pleasure. So we're going to talk a lot about Queens of Adventure. We're going to talk a lot about you and your role in putting the show together and what the show is and does, and maybe some other things that you're involved with. I know you have another podcast. You've written at least a book, if not books. But before we get too far into things here at the faculty meetings, we always like to take a moment and kind of take a step back and talk about why we're here. So the goal of faculty meetings is that through these conversations that we have, that there will be experiences and opinions shared that the listener might be able to glean some sort of nugget of wisdom that they can use at their table to make their games better. But we understand that the opinions we share and the advice we give may not work at every table every time, but there is one piece of advice that we do feel is pretty universal. And Matt, what is that one piece of advice? That is correct. So no matter what game you're playing, the system or edition, what rules you use, don't use, or misuse, as long as your table's having fun, you're doing it right. All right, so with that out of the way, one bit of housekeeping before we get too far into things. Anyone who listens to the show regularly probably already knows what's coming, a Catacon. Catacon is the convention that we run every November in Dayton, Ohio. We are currently halfway through our Kickstarter to raise our funds, as we do every year, selling badges to try to get enough money to pay our deposits. As of last checking, we are at $10,200, so we're $3,500 away, so right around 75%. Well on our way to getting there, but until that magic number is hit, I'm still going to be an anxious mess and freaking out. My hair is going even grayer. So if anyone out there is thinking about coming, please back the Kickstarter if you can for your badge. We do offer refunds up until November 1st, so if life gets in the way and you get a new job, you move, whatever, and you can't make it, we'll take care of you as best we can. But if you think you're coming, the Kickstarter is the best way to go for us. Okay, so Matt, Queens of Adventure. What is that? Of course, yeah. So I will be upfront. I know very little about drag culture. I mean, other than like happen to see stuff on TV. So I'm probably very ignorant. If I say or do anything that is way off base, feel free to slap me and correct me. But that was like my first big question was, were you drag queens that knew each other that decided to play D&D, or were you D&D players that figured out, hey, we're all drag queens? I was kind of wondering how that got started, but it sounds like this was like a comedy show. Was it comedy first, then evolved to D&D, or did it start as a comedy D&D drag show that became a podcast? Oh, wow. Hey, Matt, hold on one second. Apparently your audio is not coming through to the audience. So stand by.
way, and hopefully people will get my levels eventually.
Okay, I think I've got that fixed. Again, you would think I've never done this before. I change no settings ever, and yet every time I start this, something's different. So,
Oh yeah.
all right. So the beginning is just gone. We're not going to go back. It's too late. So let's start back over with introducing who you are, and we'll go from this. We don't have to do the whole spiel again. The catacon, no one cares about that. So because I guess they heard me, so they got my part of it. So I apologize for that. So please, once again, Matt, what is Queens of Adventure?
So Queens of Adventure is a podcast and live show. It's a drag comedy actual play experience where we have drag queens playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Excellent. So again, I'm so sorry. So we chatted a little bit again. People might have heard my side, so maybe some context clues. They might have figured out what was going on. So my kind of question was like how it got started. Sound like you had a drag queen comedy show. Your partner is involved in game design. So there was a lot of elements that brought it together. So when you first started and you were doing the comedy show, was D&D just a way to frame the comedy? Is that why it was brought in? Like, I guess I'm trying to figure out like how the pieces fit together in the Lego to make the thing.
Yeah, so for literally years, James and I have been talking about just the concept. We're like, wouldn't it be funny if we had drag queens playing Dungeons and Dragons? Like, haha, that's such a funny idea. And we just like did nothing with it. And then what really came to a head was when I went to DragCon in Los Angeles, 2 years ago, I guess. And that's the big convention that basically is themed around RuPaul's Drag Race. Mm-hmm. And so it's a lot of the reality show contestants and just drag queens everywhere and makeup people and everybody. And, I had a lot of conversations there about the idea of drag queens in a fantasy role-playing context. And people were like, oh, yeah, neat, you should do that. And then when I got home, I was like, yeah, that is neat. I should do that. And so that's how we started talking. I had zero experience with Dungeons and Dragons at that point. It was all James, and he was very aware of 5th edition having come out recently and being really compatible with entertainment and performance in a way that previous editions were not. So we started talking about like, okay, well, how would we do this? From the beginning, it was the amalgamation of drag, comedy, D&D, storytelling. It was all there together, but we had a lot of alchemy to figure out to make them all fit. But the great thing is that the more we talked about it, the more we talked to drag queens, the more we realized like, oh, actually drag queens are kind of already doing a role-playing game, and role-playing is also kind of drag already. And so, it seems really unusual to bring those two things together. But as we brought them together, we're like, oh, wait, they're like made to fit together.
Yeah.
It's kind of perfect.
So you said you didn't have a lot of experience with D&D. So are you the game master for the podcast or our player?
Yeah. So my first time DMing was on stage for 100 people.
Oh, wow.
A little terrifying. But that was, we're like, let's see if this works. So what happened was we put together just the concept for the show. We reached out to some people because I'm very active in the LGBT and drag space here in Seattle. So reached out to friends and was like, would you be interested? And sure enough, some of them were. And so then I just had a couple weeks to get up to speed as fast as I could on how to DM. And with a lot of help from James, who's a real expert here, and listening to some podcasts like The Adventure Zone and watching Critical Role and Force Grey, I kind of tried to model as best I could other people whose work I liked. Then the night of the first show came, and I get up there, and we had our adventure. We do all homebrew adventures, and had the adventure in front of me, and we had like a ton of notes. I had probably like 80 pages of notes for a 2-hour show. But I needed it all just in case.
In case, exactly.
Yeah, and it was a hit. And there's a lot of things that I was really fudging as DM at that point, but the audience had a good time. The queens had a good time. We put on a good show. That's so great.
Again, it's the motto: if you're having fun, you're doing it right.
Yeah.
So I have chat pulled up. I will try my best to kind of filter through. I don't know if you can see it or not, to kind of, let you know what's going on. So to chat, if anyone out there has any questions for myself or for Matt, feel free. We will do our best to answer them. Obviously, keep them, topical, and we reserve the right to not answer them if we don't want to, but we usually can. So a couple of people have jumped in. So not animal tested.
Oh, good. Hello. I'm familiar with not animal tested.
I don't know if it's Gibby or Gabay, and then a bunch of numbers, 314159, which is that like pi, the first 6 numbers. Tordian EQ. I think that's everyone so far that has said hello, and they thankfully let me know that no one could hear you, which would have made a terrible episode. Because though I do like to talk and would have monopolized the conversation, I think more people might be here for you than for me.
Oh,
so
that's nice.
So this makes some interesting for me the way that you're coming at it, because clearly, again, I don't know much about the culture, but I'm going to make some assumptions that being drag is a performative, thing that you're doing. So rolling into a podcast that's an actual play that's entertainment, I can definitely see how those would marry up. Mm-hmm. So was there something about DMing that was harder or easier than you thought, maybe because of your background already as a performer and as an entertainer?
Yeah, I would say, and I don't do a lot of outside of this performing myself, so I've never actually done drag. I produce and I document. I've done a lot of photography, and I support drag queens as a media person, kind of behind the camera a lot. So I'm comfortable on a mic and on camera, but it was really like the drag queens that I wanted to put front and center, as they're the heroes of the story. But yeah, and to answer your question, like stuff that was difficult and unexpected, I would say like one of the biggest challenges that I've run into, and it's something that I'm still trying to learn to be better at, is listening and talking at the same time. It's really hard to do. But it's a big challenge, is listening not just to like what are the literal words they're saying, but also what is it that they're trying to do? What is exciting to the players and the audience? Mm-hmm. And reading between the lines of like, okay, they said that. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, I think, and we've been in the show for many years, and our goal was to help people more than anything start playing. I kind of consider our show to be very sort of basic introductory advice. If you've never played before, we'll help demystify what it is. We'll get you started, and you'll get better over time. But one of the things that I tell people a lot, but I have no idea how to actually teach, is reading the table, is paying attention to your players and figuring out when someone is really engaged and excited, when someone is maybe a little bit bored, or maybe there's some content happening at the table to make someone uncomfortable. And I don't know how to tell a person to do that other than to say to do it. So is there anything that you have learned that has maybe like a tidbit or like an epiphany of now I'm doing this better?
Yeah, gosh. I'd say like one of the most helpful things that actually like a whole bunch of things are like crashing into my mind right now. So one useful things was like a conversation that James and I had. So James, my partner, is a professional game designer, and was talking to me about the reason we call RPGs is like there's the role playing and the game, mm-hmm. and there's the role play of the character that you want to create. And I mean, and this is why it works so well with drag, is both in drag and D&D, you kind of start by asking yourself, if I could be anybody, who would I be? Who am I in my imagination? And so the role playing is so important, but also the game is so important. So you're really tracking two different systems. There's the role play and the character and like the who am I and playing a role. But then there's also the nitty gritty number stuff of the system and like working within the toolbox that D&D gives you. And, so you're not just like, well, I have decided to climb vertically up the side of a building and I did it. No, you have to roll. Let's mm-hmm. see how this goes. And if you fail, it's because the system is there to create interesting challenges. So one of the things that really helped me understand how to put on a good show and be entertaining at the table was to remember to balance those two things, the role play and the game, and to make sure I'm not letting one of those things dominate the other. I'd say that's probably like, of all the things I've learned, and there's a lot, that's probably a big one. Another is actually going back to, I do a lot of work with journalism, and I write for various news outlets, and I've worked with NPR and Rolling Stone and to do coverage usually of LGBT issues. And one of the lessons I've learned from that work is the importance of it's basically a formula. And once you know it, you can't help but hear it everywhere, particularly on NPR. The formula is action, detail, punchline, reflection. You start with some action that ideally there's some conflict involved of somebody going to a goal but coming up against an obstacle. Then you fill it in with some detail. Then there's a resolution, like in music when the music resolves in a song. There's a punchline there, and then you have a little reflection after it. And what I found is like good stories, whether I'm like writing an article or doing a piece for NPR or at the table, you start with like, okay, what's the action? What's the story? What's the challenge here? Let's fill it in with some details. Now let's resolve it with the punchline that, usually escalates things. And now let's just like have a moment to reflect on how things changed and what it all meant and why that was meaningful. So that's, those are probably the two of the bigger lessons that I've learned in the process of doing the show. And those are things that I've brought in from James's expertise as a game designer and from my expertise as a writer and journalist.
All right. So I have a question for you, but before we get to that, Gabe 314159 has a question for you. Have you thought about bringing Queens of Adventure on the road outside of the U.S.? They are catching up on bonus episodes, but so far they believe they've all been domestic.
Yeah, so there are a lot of challenges to that. We do some road shows in the U.S. right now. We've done San Francisco and L.A. We're looking at a few other cities. As soon as you unfortunately, as soon as you cross like an international line, things get complicated. Yeah, so I mean, we've got Vancouver right in our backyard, and we'd love to go there. And we've got a lot of friends in Toronto, and we'd love to go there. And we've got friends in the UK, and we want to go there. But it's just one of those things of like, we just want to do a wacky, goofy comedy drag show with dragons. But also, like, as soon as you get on an airplane or cross that checkpoint, suddenly they're like, okay, and here's 3,000 forms you have to fill out. So we just need to. We need a little help to make sure we're following the law and we're not setting something up that we're going to get raided for some sort of causing an international incident, taking our dungeons and drag queens where they weren't supposed to go. But we would love to. The answer to that is we would love to. I love doing those live shows, and I love going on the road, especially when we can involve local queens. When we do our San Francisco show, we have a totally different cast. So our cast in Seattle is just fabulous players. We've got Arson Nikki, Freya Love, and Butalino Kipple, and some other guests who come in and out. Then we go to San Francisco. We've got Poya Del Mar and Kai Kai B. Michaels and Rock'em Sakura and Erica Clash. And we've had Kitty Powers, who's a UK drag queen, come in sometimes. So we love customizing each show to the group that's going to be there, which is again it's very drag show because sometimes your lineup changes very abruptly, and it's also very D&D where it's like, okay, who can make it on Thursday? See how big the party will be.
Yeah. So no current plans, but you're open to the possibility if everything lines up perfectly.
Yes, we would love to. And we're always looking for opportunities to do that. So if folks have recommendations for venues or performers that they'd like to see us work with, please let us know. We'd love to I was just talking to some folks in Portland about venues that might be good there, and talked to some queens in Chicago who would be interested. So we're still kind of building the Rolodex of places and people to be involved with.
Okay, and I may be jumping to the end, but if someone wanted to try to give support monetarily, do you have a Patreon or something people could help support?
Yeah, we do. So everything's at queensofadventure.com. So we love chatting with people. We've got a Discord link there to chat with folks. We've got a Twitter link there, and we've also got Patreon. And we're really grateful to all the supporters. We got the podcast started with a Kickstarter because we want to pay our performers and pay the artists. We have artists who do art for the show and musicians. So we want to make sure that we're supporting queer creators and getting them paid. So we're really grateful to everybody who supported us on Kickstarter and Patreon. They really make the show possible to do.
Excellent. Gabe, thank you for the question. And anyone else, again, if you have questions for Matt or myself, shoot, we'll do our best. So Matt, a couple other questions have come to my mind. Because again, I'm trying to wrap my head around how all this has worked as well. So do you now consider yourself a gamer? Do you play outside of the show?
Yeah, well, I've always felt maybe not always, but I've been I would consider myself a gamer for a long time. As a kid, NES was a big part of our lives, and I had a bad experience with TTRPGs as a youth, where one of my friends wanted to play. I think it was Vampire. I think, and like brought over a manual, or maybe it was D&D. It brought over a manual, and it just turned into like a couple hours of us just sitting there silently reading the manuals and never actually playing.
Yep.
And so that turned me off for a little while. But as I got into like high school and college, I wasn't gaming as much. But then when I got out and James and I became a couple, games were just always a part of our lives. And so he's very good at like bringing a game home and being like, I think you'll like this. And he's always right. I for a long time I consider myself a gamer in terms of like, I like Dragon Age, for example, or when I need to relax, Stardew Valley. But when we started doing the show, I hadn't done tabletop seriously ever. Mm-hmm. So I was really delighted by how easy it was to just get involved, because I thought, like, I was thinking back to that experience when I was 12 of like, oh God, it's just like 3 hours of reading silently the manual and not understanding. Mm-hmm. But what I found is like, you can just dive right in. And the same thing with our queens. Most of our queens have never played D&D before, and you can just pick it up. I mean, it's really like what they learned was it's an improv game, mm-hmm. and they all do that every time they get on stage. So get to it, basically.
Yeah. Now, I've been playing now over 30 years. I started when I was, I think just before I became a teenager. And that's just the way it worked. It wasn't right or wrong. That was just the way it worked. Is we got the books, and when we wanted to try to show the game to someone else, we would just give them the books and say, read them. We're going to play next Friday. Come with a character. And we expected them to read it, to understand it, to create their own character and come prepared. And looking back, that is such the worst possible way to try to teach anybody anything. And it's one of the things, again, some people love 5th edition, some people don't. 4th edition, again, we don't get into edition wars here. We don't care. I personally find 5th edition a very easy version of the game to teach. Mm-hmm. And I've sort of developed my own method of teaching, and it's pretty much just start. And I'll explain the rules as we need them. So the first thing we're going to do is role play. The very first thing, like, you sit down. What's your character's name? What do they look like? Is there anything interesting about them that we would know if we've been hanging out with you on the road for the last 2 weeks? And then we just start playing. And when they're like, okay, I want to hit the orc with my fist, like, okay, great. Here's on your character sheet. This is the dice you roll. High numbers are better. And then, again, we kind of just move on. And as the rules are needed, we just explain the bare minimum. Because for me, at least, the way I run the game, I have a lot more fun with the role play. I'm much more of an RPer than a G'er. So I'm going to have a lot of fun. And then if we mess up the rules, again, if we skip the rules, whatever, if you're hooked and you want to come back, then we can be a little bit more worried about if the rules, actually building the character correctly and that kind of stuff. But I've absolutely found the way just dive in and start having fun. You're much more likely to get people to come back to the next game. Go ahead.
I think that's true. Something that I think we've found is you really just need one person there, ideally the GM, who is the person who knows what's going on. I think we all have like the friend who, like, when you pull out the board game, the friend who picks out the rules and is like, okay, I'll take it from here. Mm-hmm. Like, as long as you've got that one person who really knows the business, everyone else can be kind of like maybe half paying attention, and maybe they've got a beer in their hand and maybe they're not really getting it. But the one person at the table who can say like, okay, now it's a D7, it's a D8. So go ahead and roll the D8. Yeah. And that person could just be like, oh, okay, thanks. Yeah. So it's having a rules person there is nice, so that this is something we do with the shows. We really don't put a lot of pressure on the queens to, you have to know every like intricate in and out of how this game works, and like how we've been playing for like a year and a half now, and they're still getting the hang of some of the more obscure stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, not even that obscure, but like one of them just used a reaction on their turn in combat, and I was like, oh, you used a reaction already. It's so clever. I was just delighted by it. So we don't put a lot of pressure on them to be complicated players. They're there to be funny and to tell the story. And I look at myself as the DM. My role is basically to run the world, and that means having stuff like the laws of gravity. I'm in charge of that.
Yeah, so, and I will say, I completely agree that you just need one person at the table who knows the rules, but I don't think that has to be the DM. When part of the reason why this podcast exists is I had a friend of mine. He started playing D&D with me, and he wanted to run the game, but he didn't know the rules. And I'm like, that's fine. You run the game, and I'll do the rules for you. And we kind of created a safe space and a couple hand-picked players who were okay with that type of game. And he ran a fabulous game. And again, that's where the motto comes from. Is he was like, am I doing it right? I'm like, we're all having fun, so you're doing it right. And the fact that he didn't know the rules at all did not impact our enjoyment of the game at all. So the only reason I bring that up is if there's anyone who's listening to this now or in the future who thinks this would be fun to do, it is. Jump right in. You don't need to know the rules. Just someone does. And even then, they can only be half right. Again, roll a d20, high numbers are better. That's enough to start playing the game. Pretty much.
That's it. Yeah. That's really it. We're going to tell a story. Sometimes we roll some dice to see what happens. That's kind of that. That usually when we do a live show, we tell people if you don't know anything about D&D, don't worry. We're just going to tell a story that takes place in our collective imaginations. Sometimes we roll some dice. Big numbers are good. That's it.
That's pretty much it. So one of the questions I have, because the show started before as a live entertainment show and has moved to a podcast, what has that transition been like? Is it easier? Is it harder? Because I imagine not being in front of an audience would relieve some pressure, but there's also some energy that you're missing. Like in a live show, you've got the audience there that I just feel like you're getting, their energy and their excitement, their laughter, hopefully at the right places. And then when you're in a room, assume a room together, maybe over the internet, I don't know. But any pluses or minuses from going one to the other?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like not having the audience there definitely affects the energy. So we have to be very intentional about like keeping things exciting. Another tip, I think, like an important thing that I learned was from Sly Flourish's guide, The Lazy Dungeon Master. And I think the second book, Return of Lazy Dungeon Master.
I think so.
And so that book has like a lot of great advice for putting together a session that runs well fast. And one of them is to make sure you have fantastic environments. And I think that extends to just about everything that happens in the game. There always has to be a sense of adventure and fantasy and bigness. And so, sometimes I'll make a mistake. This actually happened recently where, they're in a cave and I'm describing the cave and it's just like, this just looks like a realistic, ordinary cave. And so, in hindsight, I should have been like, glowing mushrooms or weird sounds or, giant beetles or, just keeping it. Make sure there's stuff there that is actually fantasy and exciting. With the live shows, I will say we do a lot of like physical stuff that doesn't translate to a podcast. So we'll have drag queens doing lip syncs and costume related games and a lot of audience like going out into the audience. And we sometimes we'll have like the audience describe different parts of a monster and then we put them all together and have basically an audience created monster that the queens have to fight. So that stuff's super fun with a live show. With a podcast, we can tell more of a coherent story. We can have more of a crafted narrative because we're coming up on a year that we've been in this story arc that we're in. And there's a lot of like, this was a challenge for me actually to learn was paying off on stuff that was set up. So setting stuff up early and keeping it active in the world so it can pay off later. So, I mean, it's great when that happens. It's super exciting. And I love having those moments where people are like, the audience can say, oh, that little thing that happened like 5 episodes or maybe, even like we're on episode 22 right now. That happened like 15 episodes ago. I see what was going on now. That's really fun, but also so hard to do. We really had to, we're still learning how to get like adept at editing just to like take out like the dead moments at the table where we're like, hold on, let me look that up. Or, oh wait, actually, I actually said that you were indoors. So we're going to just like, let me say that over again with like the ceiling over your head instead of the sky over your head or whatever. So yeah, there's a bit of craftsmanship that happens on the podcast that we don't get to do on the live shows because the live shows are just kind of like they're the Wild West of we just got to go. There's no time to like look stuff up or we're just going.
Yeah, it's one of the things. Again, here at the show we do a lot of like advice and opinion type shows, but we also have a whole bunch of actual plays. And I had no experience with it, but I feel like I'm pretty good now at editing, and I actually really enjoy it. There's a lot of control that I've gotten over the stories. I feel, it's again, I'm not mad power going to my head, but I can like remove a line of dialogue to add tension that wasn't there in a scene, but it still makes sense later. I've cut jokes out that were hilarious, that broke the table, was laughing, but it made no sense in the moment, so it's gone. And it's just, I don't know, I find an interest in the different experiences that we have at the table. We all have fun, and yet the crafted experience that the audience gets to hear, and how sometimes those are vastly different.
Yeah. I will say occasionally, I found the queens who we play with can sometimes get into a bit of a wardrobe loop where they're just describing their outfits for far too long. And so sometimes like that's something that we do in the edit is we're like, okay, how many times do we need to describe the buckles that you're wearing? So we might like snip out one or two of those. But yeah, the emphasis is always on like, what's exciting, what's fun, what's the story and the drama here. And I would say that's something that I'm still learning. Like it takes a long time to get a good sense for that. But thinking through like basically this is another important lesson I think that we learned in making the show or that I learned at least, is the importance of cause and effect. I mean, like that's all that a story or D&D is based on. There has to be a lot of like meaningful choices. I think is it Sid Meier who talks about like the series of interesting decisions is the thing that makes a game really work. Having exciting things that happen in the game as a result of player actions is so important. So that's when I was talking earlier about like punchlines and payoff, that's what I'm talking about is making sure that there are payoffs to the player decision, that the world responds to what players do. And it's super fun. And, when the characters are describing their outfits, maybe there's not like much that the world can do about that. But, when they're doing something like, for example, one of them wanted to chase, there's a moment many episodes ago, no spoilers for people who haven't listened yet, but there's a moment where one of them is high up on a building and they wanted to chase someone in the distance, and their idea to get to the character who's off in the distance was just to jump off the lighthouse. And I'm like, okay, well, we're going to play this out and see how the world responds to this. And so there were some rolls and some very clever last minute use of spells that allowed them to jump off the lighthouse and not die. But that was a highlight, because I was like, well, what you're doing is very unexpected. But also, as the DM, I have the tools here to see what happens. So let's grab some of these tools. Like we're gonna roll dexterity for how you're gonna be like. We're gonna do a dex save basically, and you're using a spell. This was a character who had shape water, and she was gonna try to use shape water to freeze a ski jump for herself on the way down. I was like, okay, that's probably not exactly in the spirit of that cantrip, but it's fun and goofy and we're having fun, so let's see what happens.
Yep. I absolutely believe in trying to say yes as often as possible. And again, this is just a Michael philosophy that there may be a time I say yes to something that if we think about it too hard could be game breaking, that now everyone who has this cantrip can do crazy things. But I'm just going to say no next time. Like if it's in the moment and it's fun and it's cool, it'll be okay. But if you try to abuse that, or like another player's like, well, because they were able to do that, I'm now going to be able to win every fight. It just doesn't work that way anymore. We don't know why it worked that way that time. It's a mystery, but it doesn't. So, because I'm all about trying, it doesn't mean that the characters always succeed. There is drama in failing, but I would much rather them jump off of the lighthouse than not. So I'm going to try to encourage that as best I can. I was running a game fairly recently. It was a Numenera game. I don't know if you're familiar with that one or not.
I haven't played it. I'm familiar with it, but I haven't played.
So in this particular scenario, the characters are on it's like a sand skiff. It's basically a boat that floats on sand, and it was skimming across. And then at the beginning of the game, I always want to try to get people off the boat. Like that's the goal, is to get at least one person off the boat, because there's going to be some drama. And 5 minutes into the game, I'm like, all the players are off the boat. I needed just one, because they all thought it would be interesting. It was, but it completely changed what I was trying to do. Because it's always fun to have like one person off the boat. They try to throw a rope. Now they're skiing, but when they're all off the boat, a little bit different. But for me, that's the fun. as a DM, I get to play too, because I have to react to what they do, try to make it make sense, try to keep it fun, but not just devolve completely into improv and there's no game. I'm like a 80-20 improv role play to game, but you still need a little bit, I think.
Yeah, that failure, like you were saying, it's something that I think sometimes is referred to as being a mean DM, but Adam Coble was actually talking recently about being a fan of your players, and being a fan of your players means giving them an opportunity to do what's cool, what they're great at, and they get to do what's cool, and they get to be great when you throw challenges at them. And so it's not mean at all to be like, you take damage, or you can't sneak past the guard. There have been a lot of times when the Queens tried to do something on the show, and there's one where one of our players, Freya Love, was trying to, what was she trying to do? She was trying to sneak in to a building, and she was in disguise, and I had to roll deception, and didn't go well, and she wound up kicking a imp and creating a distraction by like kicking him like a football, and so like it just got so much funnier and sillier and weirder because it didn't work, and it let her really be the star of the scene. And that's I think Adam Coble's advice about being a fan of your players is really great, because your players are really cool and they'll surprise you and surprise everybody, so give them those chances to impress even themselves.
Absolutely. Again, I would add that that the punishment for failure doesn't need to be death. Like I'm a big believer that you don't have to have a deadly game to have stakes. Again, I watch TV shows all the time. The main characters never die, but you're still engaged in their stories. Because I think it's more interesting for a character to live with failure than to die. Because in the game, you're just going to roll another character. Like you might be sad if you really love that character, but you'll get over it. Your next character will jump in and it'll be forgotten. But if you have a character that fails and then something in the game world happens and their character has to live with that failure, there's a lot more drama and interesting, I believe, to be mined from that than, oh, now you're dead. So roll a new character.
Yeah. We had in combat, we actually had a player roll extremely poorly on, I think it was a grapple. Yeah. So, oh man, there was just like a series of bad rolls, and there was a grapple. And again, I don't want to, no spoilers for folks who are listening. There was a grapple, and then somebody had a potion wasn't involved, and we were not planning basically a life-changing failure for this one character that really like completely changed the trajectory of what was going on. But they rolled badly, and they could not do what they wanted to do, and their adversary had an opportunity, and the fallout from that has really shaped the narrative going forward in ways that we didn't expect. But again, it's allowed them to really stretch their limbs creatively and become heroic in ways that we didn't anticipate. They didn't anticipate, but failing changed who they are and made them so much more interesting.
Yeah. So Gabay 314159 had asked, earlier you were saying that sometimes as the story has gone on, some elements were planted that came back a few episodes later. So they were wondering if there were any cases where elements were planted, but then as the story went on, the Queens did something unexpected, and then maybe those planted seeds don't make any more sense any longer. Any examples, or like, have there been any ways you've been able to like bring them back in a different way or something like that? I'm hoping that's the question you were asking.
Yeah, we try to be pretty economical with like story stuff. So not like introducing a ton of stuff in the hopes of like, well, maybe that'll pay off later. But of course, the players are always going to surprise you, and like one of the surprises is like what they want to focus on. So there was a part of the world that we were not expecting them to go to when they decided that it was time to go to there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that map's not been drawn yet. You can't go through that door. Sorry.
So what we did was really frantically, like there's a teacher here in Seattle named Ethan Schoonover who does technology at Lake Washington Girls Middle School and also started a D&D club and D&D classes at the school. And he talks about the importance of Minecrafting, by which he means that thing in Minecraft where if you like fly up really high and look out at the horizon, you can see that it hasn't drawn things in yet. And as a DM, you want to be like planting the trees just beyond where the players can see. So we planted trees just beyond where they could see it, just like frantically laying down that landscape for them. And, part of being able to do that means knowing your world really well. So like when they do decide to go someplace, it's consistent and isn't like confusing or suspicious. But yeah, and, I will say, like, one of the fun things that we were able to do in terms of, speaking of paying off, was there was a moment where we could tell that the players had misunderstood some things and had theories about what was going on that were partially misrememberings. Fortunately, as a podcast, we've got everything on tape. Mm-hmm. So we had we found a fantasy way for their memories to come back to them in a way that was literally us playing recordings of previous sessions to them to get them back on track and be like, here's what actually happened. So that they could actually, get a little refresher, and the audience as well, because, we're every 2 episodes or every 2 weeks we have an episode up. So sometimes people forget. So we did kind of I wouldn't call it a clip show exactly. It was a show that used clips, but pretty sparingly, just to like tweak everyone's memory and be like, here's what's going on. Here's what you decided, even if you might not remember it exactly, and use that to inform your decisions going forward to just be, to remind you of story threads that you set up or that we set up or that were interesting and then got dropped, just as, a recalibrating mechanism.
Yeah, we actually talked about that fairly recently on one of our shows. There's a part of me as a DM, like, I absolutely love it when a player latches onto some small tidbit, even if when I said it wasn't supposed to be important. It was like a throwaway, like, the blacksmith is left-handed, and then later the fact that the blacksmith was left-handed is very important. But we also play the game maybe once a week, maybe for 3 hours at a time, and there can be months of real time that transpires in what is 2 hours in the game world. So I'm not the type of DM that will punish my players if they're supposed to meet their contact in the tavern and they cannot remember that person's name. I'm just going to tell them, because their characters would not have forgotten that in the 15-minute walk over here. But my players who have been on vacation with their family 2 weeks, maybe they did. Right. Now, there's a type of game, if you're going for really hijink and hilarious, maybe it's like a Mr. Bean level funny if they say the wrong name and then there's like 2 conversations going on, like they're talking to someone over here thinking that it's the Thieves Guild Master, but the Thieves Guild Master is talking to someone else. Like, that can be funny, but if that's not what you're going for, I don't believe in punishing the players for forgetting stuff because of real life situations.
Yeah, I think that's fair. We usually do the same thing. It's a judgment call. Would the character actually remember that? But there are times, the episode that I'm working on right now, there's a moment where an NPC says something about the 9 hells, and one of our characters is a tiefling, and so I just let her know, Butylene, as a tiefling, this fact and this fact and this fact about the 9 hells. Because that probably has been said at some point in the last year and a half, but time goes by and people have lives.
Yep.
But if it's something that, might have been like some incidental detail that they might not have caught, then I might have them roll history. If it's some detail about, like, you heard some lore about something that happened 1,000 years ago, and you as the player didn't take a note about that, well, roll history to let's see if you remember.
Yeah. And it's one of the things, it's like a weird sort of judgment call, because sometimes I will just tell them and sometimes I won't, and it's just like, what do I think is the most interesting version of this story? Do they know it? Do they not know it? Do they remember it? Do they misremember it? I've got a bunch of options to decide from, and I'm going to lean towards the one I think is the most interesting in this moment. Hopefully I'm right, and hopefully the players agree. So I wanted to touch on, first I want to let everyone know Short Man Ian 444 has joined us. He's one of our regulars, a friend of the show. He's here a lot, so thank you, Ian, for jumping in. And there was some conversation a little bit earlier about how deadly games can be. I mean, we're talking about, death doesn't have to be a consequence. And someone was asking about like olden times, I guess. But at least for me, when I first started playing, absolutely, the games were deadly. And my goal as a DM was to set up a mathematically precise challenge that was built based off of who the character's abilities and that kind of thing. And then just let the dice go where they may. And if the characters lose, they die. Like, that was just the way that it was played. Vastly different now for me personally, and also I think for many people, especially newer players coming in based off of podcasts and streams and actual plays, I think there's a lot more of we're going to tell just this crazy adventure story aspect that's not the same as before. Not to say people back in the 70s didn't play that way, but I think more people played that way than do now. So there's like a cultural shift. That's just me talking out my wazoo, though, so I don't know if it's true or not, but that's my experience.
Yeah, I think that's certainly like the approach that we've taken. For one thing, because the players come to us they're playing characters with the same names that they use on stage. So, we've got Arson Nikki, the drag queen, at our table and at the live show. And we're not going to tell her like, Arson Nikki, the character on the show, died. And now, Arson, you're dead. And like, that's not our character to kill necessarily. That having been said, like if we had a conversation with Arson the performer and said like, what would you think about character death? And she's like into it, then that's something to explore.
Yeah.
And, also because death doesn't have to be permanent in D&D.
Exactly.
But we also want to be very considerate to the players and not be like, hey, so this character this name that you've been performing under for like 10 years, we're going to kill that. Yeah. That wouldn't be okay. Right. That having been said, we have done adventures where they're playing someone else. Mm-hmm. And when the Ravnica expansion came out for D&D, we did a bonus episode that was part of the podcast of Ravnica, where we had you did that too.
Yeah, we did that as well.
Yeah, so in that one, they created completely new characters for Ravnica with new names and new backgrounds, and it was just for that one-off. And nobody died, but I think they could have, and it wouldn't have been as traumatic as your very significant, like personally significant alter ego is now dead because you had a bad roll. Sorry. Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar. There's a movie, Oktoberfest. Are you familiar with that movie at all?
I don't think so.
So there's a character they call Landfill, and partway through the movie, Landfill dies. And then 5 minutes later, his brother, who's him again, and they just call him Landfill 2, and they just keep going like he was always there. So we make that joke in our games, like if your character dies and you just want to keep playing the same one, we'll just call him Landfill 2 and move on.
Okay.
So just depends, again, how you want to go with the game. So again, I'm loving all of this. I know you said you had kind of a list. Is there anything else, like any other lessons learned or just tidbits that you think might be worth sharing?
Yeah, like some smaller things that I learned kind of early on is beware of starting sentences with "and." It just kind of like slows down the pace. I mean, it's such a small thing.
Okay.
But this was a tendency that I had, was just to be like, and then you go over there, and the person says to you this line of dialogue, and you know what that means, and now you're going, like the ands just got a little repetitive.
Okay.
And then like a bigger thing for me, I'd say was...
Let me interrupt you just for a quick second. Because I have a piece of advice. I think, did you realize you were doing that because you're editing the show and you heard yourself saying that over and over again?
Actually, that was something that James noticed before I noticed it. But what I noticed myself doing that drives me crazy still when I do it is using the word "that."
Okay.
So I'll often say something like, and you can see that aquarium is still there, and that person that you spoke to earlier, like that presumes that the listener is as familiar with the thing you're talking about as the DM, and as DM, you're more familiar with the world than anyone. Ideally, if you're doing it right,
yeah.
The DM is more familiar with everything, so everything is like that, and that thing, like that thing again. Mm-hmm. Because you're sort of an expert. You're the god of the world, but players and listeners are not familiar. So when you're like, oh yeah, that CEO of the company, and people are like, wait, what? The who?
Yeah. Well, even as little as like if you're playing in a combat and you're in an audio podcast and a player says, I'm going to attack that one over there. Mm-hmm. No one listening has any idea what you're talking about. Right. But the point I wanted to get to is one of the big pieces of advice I give people is you don't have to start a podcast, though why not? Everyone does, and it's fun. But if you can, record yourself running your game and then listen back to it just to hear yourself running the game, because you will very quickly pick up on things you do well that you want to lean into and some things that you don't do well, phrases, word choices. Sometimes you can tell, I had to repeat 3 times because no one understood what I was saying, so my descriptions weren't good, or man, everyone was just really on that. As soon as it was their turn, they knew what to do. So I had them, excited. So what was I doing then that I can repeat? I'm a big believer that if you can, record yourself playing the game, listen back, just to help make you a better DM, whether you ever intend to release it in any way or not.
That's great advice. Yeah, I mean, we're recording for the podcast, but I would say there's a real benefit to listening back to the job that you do and like listening to, are my players confused, or are they impatient and bored, or more importantly, do they love this? Like, what is the part where they're really excited and their voices go up? Because that really another actually piece from the Dungeon Master's Guide is not the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Lazy Dungeon Master, is you start planning your session by thinking through what are the things that my players love most, what are they great at, and then build the encounters around that. And you can really get a sense for that from listening back to the recordings. Right.
So I apologize, I kind of cut you off to get that point in. Do you remember what you were going for?
Yeah, one of the other things that I learned was to beware. This is a very writerly thing to notice, but beware of gerunds in your sentences. So don't end your verbs on ing. Not that's not a hard and fast like never do it rule, but it's a red flag if you're like, you're walking over to the counter. It should be you walk over to the counter, because that continuity that is implied by the ing. This is such a small, like, nitpicky grammar thing, but the birds are circling in the sky. The birds circle in the sky. You want to make things immediate and impactful, and not have it be something that's just like happening around you. When you have it be an immediate verb, the scorpion attacks rather than the scorpions attacking. It makes the order of things a little disorienting. So I mean, it's such a small thing, but like, watch out for ings.
No, again, great advice. Something that you may not even realize you're doing, but if you can listen back to yourself, you might pick up on it. Yep. So one of the things I was curious about, because one of the big pieces of advice that I do it now, I didn't used to do it, but I'll resource my table a lot for. They want to go to a place like, hey, we walk into the temple. Do we see anyone? I'm like, I don't know. Do you see anyone? And I'll ask the players to fill in details of where they're at, who they know, what's going on. Even like, what's some secret about, or a rumor about this person. I imagine with drag queens being performers and improvers, they would be good at that. So is that something you do in your games?
Yeah, improv is such a big part of drag and also such a big part of D&D. And I love turning it over to the queens for things. One of my favorite things, this is something that we picked up from Critical Role, is having them describe their killing blows. It's so fun when they finally get that HP down to 0 on an enemy to say, tell me how you kill them. Players get so happy when they get to have a killing blow. And I will say, actually, on a recent episode, I asked one of the players, Butylene, I asked, how do you kill this enemy that you're fighting? And she had a great description, and she put like some really gruesome flavor onto it that for her was just like a fun description. But there was a germ of an idea in there, and we were like, let's run with that. And it turned into like a major plot point, just like the method of her death. And, I'm being a little cagey about this because I don't want to spoil it, but the way in which she killed an enemy is really going to change how things go forward. So turning it over to the players for that kind of stuff. Also, I often ask them what they're wearing, trying to keep that under control because we could be here forever. Yeah. Or, I'll ask them stuff like we just had a character who was knighted, and we had the players give that character their knight name and also name that character's blade. So it's really fun to like have the NPCs turn to the players and say, what do you think it should be called? Or what do you see in this room? Or they're there to be creative. Drag queens are great at like going out on stage with, a little bit of hot glue and a prayer. So around the table, let's see if I throw a question at you. Let's see how what you can come up with and how fast you can keep up.
Yeah, I think the killing blow is a great like starter to getting players who maybe aren't comfortable doing that. Because I know some players who literally just don't ever want to do that. Like that's not the way I play the game. You control everything as a DM. They want to believe if they open a door and there's a key behind it, that I knew the key was there first and that they didn't get to make that up. It destroys their verisimilitude. But I found most players do enjoy that, and I found that actually asking them to explain what their failures look like can be more interesting than successes. Because I always use the example, like if let's say we have a barbarian trying to climb a wall, and for whatever reason I make them roll, because normally I wouldn't, but I do in this case, and they fail, no matter how they describe it, as long as they're on this side of the wall, they can make it look like however they want. If I describe it as the DM, I'll probably go for the easy joke and say they fall on their butt. You're on your keister as the orcs attack. But I like to think that maybe the player will be like, I picked a bad route. I didn't look up the wall. I started climbing. I got to a point there's just no way to go, so I had to climb back down. Those are two very different types of characters, and one tells me a lot about them. Like I said, we can mine for later. This is a very impulsive person. They don't think ahead. They can get themselves in trouble. I can use that versus, haha, you fell on your butt, orcs attack. So if that's not something you're doing, again, to you, Matt, or to anyone listening, if you feel comfortable, start asking your players, you're attacking a goblin, you're level 7, you should have killed the goblin, but you missed. Why did you miss? Like, what happened there? And you'll be surprised sometimes at some of the interesting things they'll come up with for an in-game reason why, they faltered for some reason. And I love to mine those for story hooks for later.
Yeah, that's great. It never occurred to me to have them describe their failure, because it seems a little like kind of rubbing their noses in it. But they're great about describing their successes. So let's see what they come up with for failure.
Yeah, try it, see if it goes well. Obviously, you throw it out if you want, but I have found a lot of positive success with asking them to describe failures as well as successes. Mm-hmm. All right, so we're closing in on our hour. So we've had a few more people jump in and out of chat. Not everyone has said hello, but I think there might be some more people listening. So one more time, I'll throw it out. If you have any questions for myself or for Matt, please let us know. And while we're waiting for chat to catch up, one more time, Matt, where can people find you, find your show, anything else that you'd like for them to know?
So everything's at queensofadventure.com. You can listen to episodes. We've got a mailing list there where we announce live shows when we do live shows. You can also join us on Discord to chat with us between episodes, find us on Twitter, and also support the show on Patreon. So queensofadventure.com has everything for the show. And then for all my other projects, because I do some other podcasts and YouTube videos and stuff like that, you can look me up, mattbaume.com, and Matt Baume on Twitter, MattBaume.
And then just for me, sometime between now and next week, send me a link or an email with any links you want included, and I'll add them into the show notes when this goes out.
Sure.
So any one last thing, sharing tidbits and things, lessons learned, is there one more you'd want to touch on, again, while we're waiting for chat to catch up with any questions they might have?
I would say, one of the biggest things that I learned, this took me actually about a year to really get the hang of, is meaningful changes are so important. But what I mean by meaningful changes, because James and I have had a lot of conversation about what that means. But changes in when the players take action, I guess this goes back to cause and effect, what I was talking about earlier. But when players do something, it has to materially affect the world that changes, that responds to their change, or responds to their choice, their decision. In a way that actually matters. It's one thing to be like, well, all right, I put on the blue dress today and people compliment my blue dress. Okay, that's fine. But, it needs to be something that really alters the way things behave. So, I put on the blue dress and a spy mistakes me for their contact and I get embroiled in some intrigue because they thought I was somebody else. The choices need to have, real impact on stuff that changes the course of the story. I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned, and very hard to do on the fly, because you're listening to your players, you're thinking 3 steps ahead. You're also keeping in mind all the rules of the game of oh no, was that supposed to be intelligence or wisdom? Oh no, so there's just so much going on. But I would say meaningful changes, the importance of meaningful change, that's really the rewarding thing for the players, is seeing I press the button. Now what happens?
And I would say that's one of the maybe the benefits of the way this game generally works, where you play for a few hours every week or two, that you might be able to think about something like, I didn't use the fact that they put on the blue dress, but now that I've had a week to think about it, I can add that in now. So there's a chance that even if you don't in the moment, if you don't think of it, if you miss maybe an opportunity, doesn't mean it's gone forever. You can still try to link that back in. Maybe even do a little bit of retconning. Like, we left here, but we're actually going to go five minutes back, and we're going to start before you walk through the door and pick the story up. And then, again, I think most players are going to be fine with that. And for the podcast audience, they'll never know. So I had a couple questions that came in. One of them, I'll start with you, Matt, and give you some time to think while I answer the other one. Do you have any rewarding or treasured gaming moments? So while you're thinking on that, I will answer Wash's question. Yes, I'm going to Lexicon this weekend. I am running Numenera, D&D, I think Shadow the Demon Lord, or Marvel. I'm running 3 or 4 different systems. I was coming down Friday, but no one signed up, so I'm just coming in Saturday. But I think I'm running four things. I believe it's Marvel Superheroes, D&D, Numenera, and Shadow the Demon Lord. So definitely more than just D&D, but I honestly don't remember right now. Okay, so back to you, Matt. So could you think of any rewarding or treasured moments from gaming that just sit with you and make you smile when you think about them?
Yeah, there was a moment at the very end of a session a couple months ago where the players were formulating this intricate plan that they thought they were being crafty and clever about it. But the one thing that they didn't know, one of them was invisible and thought that she was and so far she was getting away with sneaking into an environment. And the players were just giving each other like nonverbal signals while there was an enemy present. And they were like, okay, we've got them fooled and nobody knows what we're up to. And the invisible character is going to be able to like sneak around and do all this stuff. What they didn't know is that the enemy had telepathy and knew where everything was and what they were thinking. And so when that was revealed telepathically, the collective shock around the table was so deeply rewarding. It fills me with joy to this day. The pulling the rug out from under them, not in a way that it wasn't a cheat and it didn't feel unfair, because there were indications that maybe this was possible. But there was just like enough of a hint that they didn't pick up on, that when it was finally revealed, it was like a really rewarding moment of, oh no, this changes everything. And we just made things so much worse because we thought this was happening, but it actually was this.
Yeah, that's awesome. That could be a great moment. For me, again, I've been playing so long. I'm sure I'm forgetting 1,000 moments that would, if I could remember them, would make me smile. But a couple that have fairly recent. I'm a father. I got 2 kids, 9 and almost 8. Now we've started playing with them last couple of years, and we started playing a game called No Thank You Evil. Again, it's by Monty Cook Games. It's like a even more rules-like version of Cypher System. And when you play that game, because it's designed to play with kids, they're like little paper standee minis, so they're not the pewter or molded plastic, they're just like little paper. But they're very cool looking, very evocative. And one of them is like a boy dressed like a wizard, got a robe and a staff. And there's like a cat on his shoulder, but the cat is made out of bubbles. And for whatever reason, my oldest son just latched onto that. And he started playing that game as the Bubble Wizard, and he's basically Green Lantern with bubbles. So he makes bubble bridges, he makes bubble animals. Everything is just an extension of the bubbles, and I love that he does that. And again, I don't care what the rules say; that's what happens. And I just love feeding into the fact that he loves that he can just create these bubbles, and sometimes he makes them stronger so they can float him up like Magneto in a bubble and make bubble walls, all kinds of crazy stuff. I love that. And then the other one would be with the other son that they were both playing together. It was the first time we played actual D&D. Because we started with No Thank You Evil. It's a little easier. So we decided to play D&D together, 5th edition. They both played Wizards, so they're the Wizard Brothers. And the first time we actually rolled a die, he got a natural 20. So it was like I made the biggest deal of it. But he still thinks that that's just how the game works. That you just, because we only rolled the dice 4 times the whole game, and his first one was a natural 20. And I don't think they failed anything that first game. So they have a very skewed idea of how the game works. But they both really like it, and they keep asking. They actually want to play more than I'm willing to run, and this is getting way into my psychology, but I'm kind of afraid of screwing it up. Like, I'm afraid that I'm going to give like a bad session and then it's going to ruin this thing that I want to be such an important part of our lives. But when we play, we have a lot of fun. And I'm so excited to play those games with my kids. So those are the easy answers for treasured moments for me right now. But thank you for the question, Shortman Ian. Thank you to anyone else on all the other questions. So Matt, any final words before we wrap this up?
Gosh, no, I think thanks for having me. And our sign off for the show is it's a riff on a RuPaul slogan. We end all of our shows with "Sissy that roll," and so I guess that's what I'd leave you with.
Excellent. Though, thank you very much. To everyone in chat, we're going to do the awkward wave out. Again, this will be an audio-only version in a couple weeks. And if you're new to this show from Matt, please go back and check out some of our other episodes. We got like 600 episodes of actual plays as well as advice and opinion shows. Very positive. We try to just get people playing games and having fun. So with that,